keep the conversation going, but this session today will be kind of expanding about how we think about tech policy and seeing where each of us can have a seat at the table. We're using the Policy Circle Roundtable format, a conversation style where everyone has a voice. We'll start by sharing the lens through which we look at and how it brings us to tech policy, then dive into what matters most and how government at every level plays a role. And then we'll finish with a call to action, how each of us here can get involved. We've got a timer to keep things moving, and we'll be keeping a close eye on that, but let's get started. My name is Maggie Wooden. I'm co-founder of Thornhill Advisors. But before starting Thornhill, I spent many years on Capitol Hill, and my background in federal policy and advocacy gives me a unique perspective on how technology and AI intersect in governance and public policy. To start, I'd like each of you to share the lens through which you approach and define tech policy, the set of rules and principles that guide how technology is developed, used, and governed. What is your mindset when it comes to AI and the guardrails we need to ensure technology serves people responsibly? The Policy Insight presents three mindsets: proactive governance, learning from the past 20 years to prevent harm, minimal guardrails, to innovate. We need to remain competitive with the rest of the world, and flipping the paradigm, focusing on data, specifically human data, and whether or not it should be a product on which companies are profiting, but that instead we should own our own data. So I'd love for you guys to all start, kind of introduce yourselves, and then explain to us the lens through which you view AI and tech policy. Matt, let's start with you.
Thank you. My name is Matt Ligori. I'm the Director of Strategic Engagement for Arizona Public Service. We are Arizona's longest serving and largest electric utility. So I'm looking at this conversation through the lens of energy. AI and data centers are driving unprecedented demand growth here in Arizona and across the United States. And so APS is looking at this conversation through the lens of how do we build the infrastructure that we need to meet the state's needs, and how do we do so in a way that's going to, how do we serve this sector in a way that's going to preserve reliability of the grid, to ensure that we're not shifting costs to residential and small commercial ratepayers, and how we're doing this in a way to preserve capacity for organic growth in our communities, for the mom and pop restaurants, for other small commercial and residential growth. So that's the lens that I'm looking at this conversation through.
Great. Margaret?
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be here. Love the Policy Circle, and great to be with these folks on the panel today, or the roundtable today. My name is Margaret Woolley-Bussey, and I am the Executive Director of the Utah Department of Commerce. So I serve at the direction of Governor Spencer Cox, who governs Utah, and our agency is really the chief business regulatory agency. So we house, for instance, the consumer protection function for the state of Utah. We actually also regulate public utilities, so we're involved in those conversations around data centers and energy demand. But specifically, Utah has, I think, a really interesting ethos when it comes to tech. We are very tech forward. We have our own sort of area, we call it Silicon Slopes, and it's all about tech companies, and we have some of the leading tech companies in the country, and a very robust ecosystem of startups. But we also care about individual agency, human agency, and we care about families, and we care about kids. And so because of that, we have innovated around tech policy. We were the first state to pass a law to regulate social media to protect kids. And we've also sued Meta and TikTok and Snap. Those lawsuits have come from our department under our consumer protection function, and because of the harms to kids. And so when the first public LLM came about 3 years ago now, offered to us by OpenAI, the immediate thought that I had was amazing, exciting, but also, oh my goodness, given that a lot of these companies that are going to be deploying AI and building AI are the same ones that sort of exploited our kids with social media, what does that mean for our future? And the power of these technologies to now not just be able to collect our information through our likes and our posts on social media, but now we're literally typing into a chat bot the most personal information about us. And now the orders of magnitude of how that data can now be processed to potentially use to exploit or manipulate is astounding. And so that was kind of the first thought I had. And so what Utah did, but at the same time, we're innovative. And we want to protect and uphold our startup environment. And so what we did in Utah is we created an Office of AI Policy, which I stood up in our department, and it really has two functions. One is to run a series of sort of what we call learning agendas to enable us to look and see where there might be harms, might be some places where we need guardrails, and also places where we might need to get rid of guardrails for this new technology to thrive. On the other side of it is what we call the regulatory sandbox, which allows AI companies to come to us and say, hey, we have this amazing idea, but we need some regulatory exemptions. Again, maybe old regulations that don't make sense, created in an era that never contemplated something like an LLM. And we want to be able to do that. Can we experiment? Can you exempt us from a law? So we really have this very much of a, we need to put in appropriate guardrails. We also need to allow innovation. And so I actually don't think that there is a huge trade-off there. I actually think that those two things work in tandem for two reasons. One is that if we don't build trustworthy technology, it's not going to be beneficial, and people won't use it. There was a lot of distrust and mistrust with these models because of what happened with social media. So we have to build them in a trustworthy way. And the second thing is we talk a lot about we've got to beat China. If we have any kind of regulatory barriers, then we won't be able to beat China. And I just don't believe that. Again, if we can't build it in a way that is trustworthy, it doesn't matter, and it won't allow us to innovate. But also, why would we want to beat China if we can't build it in a way that is good for humanity?
Yeah.
So those are my thoughts.
Yeah, a lot to unpack there. We'll continue that conversation. But TJ, I'd love to have you introduce yourself and kind of share the lens you view it.
Yeah, thank you, Maggie. It's absolutely wonderful to be here with you all today. I can't tell you enough. All the conversations I've been having are just incredible. Sylvie, Allie, you, the Policy Circle team and staff, kudos to you guys on really putting on an incredible show. I was very proud to lead economic development for the state of Florida for 3 years under Governor DeSantis. And I would really focus on bringing in high-paying jobs in target industry sectors, life sciences, aviation, aerospace, technology. About a year ago, I left and I joined Florida's largest innovation platform and a family office in the Medina family that really helped create Miami, South Florida as a tech and innovation hub that it is today. And it's incredible to see this transformation for the state of Florida, for South Florida, and for Miami in particular. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. But the thing that I want to leave with you all, what you do today and what you do in your communities matters. Policy matters. We live in a very competitive global landscape. We live everywhere around the world. Individuals are competing, companies are competing for capital, for business, for investment, and for growth, right? States are competing, countries are competing. And so what we've seen around the world is that when you create policies that are attractive to business investment, attractive to capital, it will flow to you. If you create policies that actually harm or hinder innovation, you will start to see those effects over time. And I think being in this state, being in the Southeast, it's a true testament to that. And really, we're only the beginning. So I'm excited to keep jumping into this conversation with you all.
Look forward to it. Jennifer.
Thanks. I'm Jennifer Huddleston. I'm a senior fellow in technology policy at the Cato Institute, which is a libertarian think tank dedicated to the ideas of a free society based in Washington, D.C. My research focuses on the intersection of law and technology, and so I've been doing a lot of work on AI issues over the last year. But I really want to get to what the framework showed, as well as to how the question was actually asked, which I think was really interesting, of what lens do you look at this through? Because all of us bring our own experiences when we're talking about particularly technology. So in addition to working as a policy researcher, I'm also an adjunct professor. So I have some experience with what it's like to have this come up in a law school classroom. Before I worked in policy, I was an upper elementary school and middle school teacher in the Mississippi Delta and at a charter school in Houston, Texas. So when I think about innovation policy, even though those babies are now no longer babies, and it really scares me that I realized recently that my intern is probably younger than my students that I taught when they were in 4th grade now. I still think about the impact that technology can have, particularly in rural communities like where I taught in the Mississippi Delta. And so when I'm thinking about this, I'm not only thinking about it in the federal policy framework, I'm also thinking about what does this mean for the end consumer? And what does it mean for our society and for a wide variety of portions of our society? What does it mean not only for the person living in Silicon Valley who may be working on this technology, what does it also mean for my students that I taught in the Mississippi Delta? Whether they're still 4th graders like they are in my mind, or whether they're actually the 20-something-year-olds that they are now in real life. And I think that's really important when we talk about what policy framework matters. Because when I think about what did the US get right when it came to our kind of last significant technological innovation, when we're talking about the internet era, it was that we largely took that light touch framework, that we said we want to see innovators, we want to see society put this tool to use in positive ways. We're going to have the government regulate only when necessary, as opposed to Europe, which took a really top-down approach and said you needed to go ask permission first. If we hadn't proven 100% safe, we were going to always err on the side of risk averse in Europe. And we've seen the real consequences of what that means in terms of Europe's innovation sector. And that's far broader than just the policy we think of as tech policy. That goes to many other factors as well around how we talk about and use these tools, around different elements, as we'll talk about when we talk about the principles, whether it's now conversations around energy policy or tariffs or things like that as well. As I mentioned, my background is in law, so I do tend to think about this from a legal framework. So one of the other things I'm thinking about is how can common law already answer many of the questions and concerns we have around AI? Are we actually asking new questions, or are we still having the same debates that we've been having not only with the internet, but with many technologies before that? When we're talking about things like privacy or speech or intellectual property, how does that play out with our existing frameworks before we rush to kind of add on another layer of regulation?
Yeah, it's great. I appreciate that. I want to get a little bit more specific, but to kind of piggyback off of what you were saying, Margaret, I think, I certainly look at things through the federal lens, right? Policy and politics. And I think there's a lot of questions, as you point out, of where the state should be engaged versus where the, federal policy, federal regulation should be engaged. And because Congress is such a reactive body, not a proactive body, I think that's really kind of where we're going to start to see some of the questions about giving the space to, be completely non-regulatory to allow for that innovation versus the safety, the transparency, some of these things we're starting to see, and where there's a balance and what states may be doing it well with the balance versus what the federal government should be doing. But kind of diving into this tech policy, the insight, right? There were 6 spokes outlined within the insight, from privacy to infrastructure, that together shape how technology is developed. So which of these spokes feels most urgent to you, TJ, and how is it relevant in your world right now?
Yeah, that's excellent. I think this is a great framework. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is energy, right? You have to build the capacity to allow this AI economy to really thrive. And China understands that. The CCP understands that better than anybody else on the planet. And so they've made energy cheap and abundant, maybe not sustainable. In the United States, we could do that. So we have to figure out a way to make it as cheap and abundant and sustainable as possible in order to create all the compute necessary to compete. And it's going to come down to policy. How do you incentivize the proper behavior in this space? The second thing that I love to look at is taxation and I would say regulatory, business, the regulatory business environment. It has been amazing to see how money moves around this planet, and it flows like a river to where there's least resistance. The amount of millionaires leaving the United Kingdom and moving to Dubai is staggering. The amount of folks that have moved from New York to Florida, staggering. Same thing with California to Texas, right? Tax policy matters. And so it's really, how do you get now this new wealth that we found, particularly in the Southeast, to invest in these types of businesses in the AI economy to really drive a lot of this growth. And then the last thing I'll say is just on innovation. It's amazing to me to see when government gets out of the way, how you allow entrepreneurship to thrive. Florida is the #1 state in the country right now for new business formations, startups, more than California, not even per capita, I'm telling you, volume. And it's because Florida's regulatory environment is so out of the way that it allows your average person, entrepreneur, to start a company and build and grow and take a risk. And that's the beauty of this country, and that's why we're the innovation engine of the planet. And to your point, why, unfortunately, Europe, Canada, our big partners now are suffering greatly. And that's one of the big things I'm concerned about, because we have been doubling their productivity, and we're doing quite well here in the country. And if we don't have our allies as strong as us, it's going to be a challenge going against China alone.
Oh, definitely. We're seeing that, right, with the critical minerals and the action China has taken right now. I think the building off of taxes, right, tariffs, the export controls, these are things we all need to think about in that kind of broader conversation in the global economy. Margaret, I'd love to kind of hear your perspective on this as well.
Well, first of all, I 100% agree with TJ on the energy piece. So one of the things that Governor Cox has done is he announced Operation Gigawatt, and said that Utah would be, in the next 10 years, doubling its ability to produce energy, which is a pretty bold goal. And it's really all because we see that this demand is surging. We want to make sure that we can power not just AI, but continue to power the bread and butter of sort of small businesses and retail customers like us. And so that's just incredibly important. And in fact, we helped to contribute to a bill that was passed last year in Utah around enabling private purveyors of energy to come through and not necessarily have to go through the public utility. That might offend folks like you, but anyway, it was sort of a dual path in order to get energy online as quickly as possible. So incredibly important. I also think that I think there's sort of this blanket viewpoint of a regulation stifling innovation. And I think that it's really, as we like to say, the devil in the details. There are some kinds of regulation that absolutely will stifle innovation. And there are some kinds of regulation that does not necessarily stifle innovation, but does help us to make sure that we are safe and protected as humans, as consumers. And so I don't think there always has to be this trade-off. Sometimes there is, but sometimes if you have a situation where there is, again, no regulation, people are afraid to engage, and there's not a trust element there. And that's, I think, what's important. So I just want to give an example of some legislation that we got passed through the work of our Office of AI Policy, where we really created this sort of dual path. We created a path for innovators, and we also sort of put in place guardrails we thought were important. And that was around mental health chatbots. So these are different than your broad-based AI companions. These are specifically therapy bots, right? Now, we can all see that there are tremendous benefits from having places for people to go when they're in a mental health crisis or just need some help. And we know we also have a shortage of mental health care workers across the country and certainly in Utah. So we could use this extra capacity. We wanted to create a pathway for folks in this space to innovate. And so what we did in law, but we also had concerns. One was, again, now you're putting in the most personal information about you into these bots, and what the default business model is, doesn't have to be this, but what it has been is collect your data, sell your data, share your data, and then use it to serve up targeted ads, right? And so we didn't like that idea. That felt bad to us, putting in really, really personal information about yourself and then being able to be served up targeted ads based on that. And so we simply said you can't share or sell the data. But there was another issue. In the state of Utah, like any other state, you have to be a licensed mental health care provider, and you actually get licensed through our department. So how do we license a bot? Well, we said in this law, we will not, our department will not go after this bot for unlicensed practice because we could. We will not do that if you as a company that are using or providing these bots are following these 10 best practices of how to put responsible guardrails, how to be testing appropriately. So we gave them a pathway to innovate, because right now we could go after any mental health therapy bot and shut it down. We don't want to do that. We want to give them a pathway to innovate. So that was just an example of how we sort of structured a law to give pathways to innovate, because again, those regulations that said you have to be a licensed healthcare provider, which means you have to be human to be able to provide this care, never contemplated the idea that a bot could do it.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the way that we are seeing what we're doing in the type of legislation that we're working on within our Office of AI Policy.
Interesting. And I think, the energy piece of this is what I think very interesting, if not also from that kind of point I made earlier of policy and politics, right? I think if you start to see folks with increased energy bills and these costs passed down to them, there will be concerns, and political ramifications likely with regards to the way people think about AI, because they associate the increased costs that they have passed down to them every day and the increased innovation and AI. So it's an ongoing conversation. I'd love to hear what you have to think, Matt.
Yeah, thank you. And it's not going to come as a surprise to the audience that the spokes that are the highest on my mind right now are energy and critical infrastructure. So I think TJ and Margaret did a good job of hitting on the demand that AI and data centers are driving right now, but I thought it would be good to provide some context for you all. So from 2010 to about a couple of years ago, the electric utility industry was dealing with these dynamics where we had flat to declining growth depending on what state you were in. And that was really being driven by increases in energy efficiency, advanced manufacturing going overseas, and then the adoption of rooftop solar. So we were in this period where we wondered if we were going to need to build much more infrastructure because society was kind of going in a different direction. That era of flat growth died a couple years ago, and now we're in an absolute opposite kind of time frame right now. Where we're seeing in Arizona year-over-year demand projections of 4.3% growth year-over-year. In the United States, it's about 2.5%. So for us at APS, we're looking at this as, how do we have the energy resources we need, and how do we build that critical infrastructure? On the energy side, right, for policymakers, we feel as a company that we need to embrace an all-the-above approach. We operate coal assets, natural gas, nuclear, renewables, and we feel like we need it all. So even if you have agreement on resources in the policy space, you still need to build things. And we're in this environment right now that's really being characterized by a lot of NIMBYism. And so that really worries us as well, is that, we have to build these new generation assets, we have to build new transmission, and how are we going to be able to get that done when, a lot of people don't want to see things built in their backyard? So right now, APS, we have 7,000 megawatts of renewable energy under construction. We are currently expanding 2 natural gas plants. The state, unfortunately, has declining natural gas capacity available in the state, and so we're partnering with an interstate pipeline company to bring a new natural gas pipeline in from Texas. We've announced in the last few months that we are going to be pursuing a new nuclear project with our utility brethren. So all of this stuff is coming up, and we're really excited about it all, but getting it built is going to be the challenge. So we're really, we have that critical infrastructure spoke definitely on our mind. And lastly, the last thing I'll touch on is accountability, right? And you touched on it, how are data centers and AI and the demand that they're driving, how is that going to impact everyday folks when it comes to their utility bills? So, we want to make sure as a utility that when we are building this infrastructure, that the folks that are driving these costs are paying their fair share. So we have some proposals that are pending, before our Public Utility Commission to make sure that data centers are paying mandatory minimums for capacity and for energy, and we're making sure that they sign long-term contracts so that, again, residential and small commercial customers are not left holding the bill for this infrastructure if these companies decide to pick up and leave. Our PUC has also opened a docket, which is essentially an investigation into some of these issues to make sure that, again, costs are being taken care of by the appropriate parties. So those are the things that are high on my mind right now, and I think it's going to be a conversation that's not unique to Arizona, but utilities across the United States.
Yeah, and Jennifer, obviously you're less tangible, but what are the concerns, spokes that you're thinking about?
I actually want to focus on one of the spokes that was not mentioned yet, which is the privacy spoke.
Yeah.
So first off, I do like the idea. I like that it was framed as a circle, because no one of these spokes stands on its own. We're going to have all of these conversations. I'm increasingly having conversations with, for example, one of the scholars on our energy team about what does it mean to see this intersection of AI and energy policy. What are the ways innovation can fuel energy policy, as well as what are the ways that bad energy policy can, quite frankly, stand in the way of innovation. Same thing with, as was discussed with tariffs and taxation and various other elements. But I think the privacy conversation is really interesting because it goes back to that trust element that was brought up, but also it's a good example of something where we've been having this tech policy conversation, and now we have yet another element to add to it. So there's been a long-standing debate about what should a data privacy framework look like. And when we're discussing data privacy, it's discussed in multiple ways, and I think it's very important to clarify those two things. One is a consumer privacy question. What rights should you as a consumer have when you willingly choose to give a company that you have selected that data? That's a conversation that can happen both in terms of best practices as well as in potential discussions of what a framework would look like, whether it's for specific areas like children's privacy or more generally around data privacy for all citizens. We have a 20-state and growing patchwork of consumer data privacy laws, which can make it confusing for both consumers to understand what's covered, as well as for innovators to know whether Utah's law and Virginia's law are different and have to comply with that. And now if you're an AI innovator, you're dealing with that as well as the internet. But there's also an element of privacy when it comes to the government's use of AI. And that's a situation where an individual doesn't have the choice of whether or not to give up the data. There are a lot of really great potential uses of AI in the government to help constituents better connect with their services. Certainly, we want the VA health system to have access to the same kind of AI medical technology that a private health system would. We don't want a situation where the government can't use this technology at all and we somehow accidentally ban spell check from government offices or something like that. But we also want to make sure that, given that these are not voluntary exchanges, that the government has access to a lot of data, that there's appropriate civil liberty guardrails in place. So this is as much about governments, whether it's state, local, or federal governments, restraining themselves and being able to give their citizens that element of trust that the data we collect will only be used for these purposes, or this is when we're saying we will use data for AI, or closing loopholes. I know Utah has actually done a lot of work on this, so that when it comes to questions around when can law enforcement access certain data, ensuring that in a digital age, that's held to the same standards as in an analog age. If you need a warrant for it, if it was on paper, do you need a warrant for it if it's in the cloud? And finding solutions that both enable positive law enforcement while also balancing those civil liberties when necessary.
Yeah. So building on that, right, we've talked a lot about it already, but the role of government, and then it's, it's really broken down to national, state, and local. I think, we've seen probably, especially in the last year, just with the recent discussion on this 10-year state moratorium push at the federal level, this idea of how the federal government should be enacting policies, we've seen it come to light a lot more recently. I think the question, I certainly have, is who's educating the lawmakers as well on what really makes sense and what precedent is there for them to use. And I think, candidly, I think the 10-year moratorium was really what thrust it into the kind of public for these members who weren't really tracking this until they realized it was included in the reconciliation bill. So, I'm certainly looking at it from a federal perspective, but Margaret, obviously you've touched a lot about what you guys are doing at the state level. How do you see kind of the state level policy informing, what's happening at the local level, and how you view it also with regard to what could potentially happen at the federal level?
Yeah, thank you. It's such an important question, and Jennifer touched on it also with her sort of talk about the different privacy laws that we have across the country. And to be fully transparent, when that came to light, I happened to be out in DC speaking on AI, and so I went to all of our federal delegation and to members of the House and Senate Commerce Committees and talked about why we did not like that proposed moratorium on state level AI regulation. And
how many of them knew about it?
Actually, interestingly, it was just had come out of the House, the big beautiful bill.
Yeah.
And our House reps did not know about it. They
Yeah.
did not know, and as soon as
They'd
they
already
found
voted
out
on it,
about
and they didn't
were
know.
like, oh
Yes,
my gosh, what
yes.
did we just do? And
Right.
then literally for the next month, I was on the phone probably every day with
Right.
our two senators and people in the Senate Commerce Committee. But the reason I think it's really it's important is that for state level legislation to proceed is that it can help to inform national policy. I do believe we need a national solution on privacy, on data ownership. I absolutely would believe it. And I believe that we also need something on really the whatever we think is the best approach for AI, for the regulation of the frontier or the foundational models. And I think states' role can be more in the deployment versus the development. And that's where we've really focused our energies. Because that's where traditionally we think of what state and federal laws, the differentiation between those two. There are different jurisdictions that we've been given in our Constitution. Okay. But I think it really can help to inform. And I think that's really important because, to be honest, I don't think anyone has all the answers. Like nobody actually knows what is the best right policy. And I'm not talking about just like political debates about what the right policy. I don't think anyone can actually stand up and say, this is it.
Totally. Yeah.
There's a lot of uncertainty. And so I think allowing states to kind of experiment a little bit and some of these laws to come forward can help to get to a federal solution.
Yeah, we're seeing that even within industry, right? There are challenges right now within industry of different perspectives on even the most recent bill passed in California and who supports it and who doesn't, and what that looks like and what degree of transparency they think they should be subject to, things like that. It's an ongoing conversation for sure. I'd love to kind of hear more about what you think about this, Matt.
Yeah, and just with any topic, right? Policy drives outcomes, and we've seen it here in Arizona, and I'll specifically use the example of data centers. I mentioned that in the 2010s we were in this era of flat demand, and so at that time, not understanding what was coming down the pike, the legislature and the governor enacted a law that provided pretty generous sales tax and use tax incentives to data centers. So we've seen now Arizona become a hotbed for data center growth here in Arizona. And so that's a good example of how policy matters. Now that we're seeing that growth in Arizona, we're seeing local governments, the Corporation Commission, which is our PUC, now starting to dive in as well. At the local level, we've seen our larger cities that are more developed, that have less available land, start to really push back on data center growth in their communities. So Phoenix, Chandler, Mesa, the latter two are suburbs on the east side. they've enacted zoning regulations that make it very difficult for data centers to set up shop in those communities. On the flip side of that, we have some of our developing suburbs on the west side of Phoenix, Surprise, Buckeye, that are really, gung-ho about data centers. They see them as an opportunity to get, major investment in their growing communities. These facilities have, they don't require a lot of services, so you're getting the property tax benefit without a lot of need to provide services to, to those companies. So it's an interesting, development here in the Valley at the local level that we're seeing kind of different communities take different approaches. Yeah. Then at the state level, I mentioned that our PUC is doing this investigation into costs and energy need, but now the legislature, over 10 years later, we're hearing that there's going to be bills this next legislative session to either promote AI and data center growth or constrain it. So I think this next legislative session will be very interesting to see kind of where our elected leaders come down and how they're going to either try to promote that growth or constrain it.
Yeah, Jennifer, at the think tank level, how do you see this?
Yeah, and I'll try and keep my comments somewhat brief.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm a bit of the odd man out here, being the one that, like Maggie, focuses more on a federal level than on a state level. But in AI, you've had to, just like with data privacy, because I want to put this into context for you. Last legislative session, there were over 1,000 bills in state legislatures dealing with AI. When was the last time you heard of any policy area having over 1,000 bills in a single legislative term? And we're expecting to see that many, if not more, again this coming year. I think the concern that is while there are many of these proposals that actually may deal with intra-state issues within a state's borders, things like data centers or electricity or taxation, many of them are also dealing with interstate issues, because AI, by its very nature, isn't going to stop at state boundaries when it comes to the development of this technology. And so what we want to be very careful of, and what I am concerned about when thinking about what we've seen happen in data privacy with this patchwork, is a world where our innovators get stuck in this awful California Brussels sandwich. And that's not some kind of weird concoction of chocolate and avocado. It is instead when you have really restrictive technology policy based out of state legislature, typically in Sacramento, California, but we've seen these occur in other states as well. Colorado, for example, has quite a significant AI regulatory law that may soon be going into effect. And Brussels, where we know, as we were discussing at the beginning, that the Europeans like to take a much more regulatory approach. And as a result, American innovators, particularly small and mid-sized innovators, can find themselves stuck in terms of making really hard decisions that may not be what they think is best for their consumers or for the future of the technology.
Yeah. Well, we've given you all a lot of information today, and I think now to wrap things up, it's important to focus on where can you all engage, where can you plug in. TJ, I'd love to kind of hear from you, what is your advice to folks here in the room and engaging in this conversation at the state, local, at the local level, et cetera?
Yeah, I think it's really important for everybody to go back to your communities and really share the story that we are in the fight for our lives. This is the space race of our generation. The president announced it back in July. We need to distribute our AI tech stack over Chinese tech stack, right? The more that they distribute, the more they get that out there, it's going to be much harder for us in this race for AGI. And already, their industrial policy, what they've been doing in China, I don't think people understand how far ahead they've gotten with robots, with manufacturing. It is really crazy that we don't understand this well enough. And so this is the platform as leaders that you all have, that to go back into your communities and let them know. Because, it's economic development's incredible, because you have times when you want to attract business, investment, and growth. And then when all that growth comes to your community, then you get the NIMBYism. Then you get the folks that are saying, no, we need to stop it, right? And that's why California's suffering. That's why Europe is suffering. We cannot let that happen. We have to innovate, we have to grow, and we have to allow our entrepreneurs and founders and capital to really drive this growth in this really important area so we can beat the CCP long term.
Yeah, I would say I think, at the federal level, engaging in these conversations with these members of Congress, at the executive level, these regulatory comment periods, that's where you can certainly get involved as well. But I think, it's so important just to kind of continue to have these ongoing conversations with people on both sides of it, right? You've got to hear where industry feels why it's so important to keep that regulatory space so minimal versus that of some of the other folks focused on transparency, safety, and where there's a balance between the two. Margaret, I'd love for you to kind of just wrap and offer some ways for folks to get involved at the state level as we wrap up this panel. Very interesting conversation.
Well, as Jennifer said, there were a lot of bills across the United States about AI. And what that really speaks to is this is a very important issue that policymakers are paying attention to. But it also speaks to that we don't really have all the right solutions, which means that you all have an amazing opportunity to be able to impact where we are. And I think, how many of you guys know who your state legislators are? Okay, because you guys are an engaged group. I would say most people are not like that. But that's awesome. Those are the people, I bet, and you can access them so much easier than you can your federal delegation. I would start with your state folks. And just let them know where you are on data centers, on opportunity with AI, on privacy from the government standpoint, and on consumer privacy, and on potential harms and potential opportunities. They will listen. They know that this is probably the #1 policy area of concern, certainly right now, and probably within the last, 30, 40 years.
Yeah.
And so this is a time to speak up because nobody has all the right answers, and everyone is looking for them.
Yeah, there are a number of states that are doing things right now, right? You've mentioned California, you mentioned Colorado, obviously Utah. Take a look at what they're doing, right? Compare and contrast the ways in which these states are approaching policy and see where it aligns with what you value and the things that you're most concerned about. I want to thank everyone today for a very constructive conversation. And as we continue throughout the day, I want you all to keep a few questions in mind. What do I value most, and what needle do I want to move? And how can I engage with policymakers at all levels of government to help them shape the policies that drive innovation? The Policy Circle offers a series of great insights that you can take back to your community and network to spark these same conversations and keep them going long after today. Thank you again for your time, and we encourage you to keep working with the Policy Circle on this and so many other important issues. Yep, thanks. Thank you.